There are moments in life when everything feels heavier than usual, and you cannot fully explain why. You keep trying to stay strong. You continue moving forward. You answer messages, go to work, speak to people normally, but deep inside, your heart feels tired in a way that rest alone cannot fix. Sometimes the pain is not loud. Sometimes it is silent. It hides behind forced smiles, distracted conversations, and long nights where your mind refuses to slow down. And little by little, you begin carrying emotional weight that nobody around you truly sees. Maybe lately you have been feeling emotionally overwhelmed. Not because of one single problem, but because too many things have been happening at once. Too many worries. Too many unanswered prayers. Too many moments where life stopped making sense the way it once did. And the hardest part is that people often expect you to continue functioning normally while your soul feels exhausted internally. So you keep going. You keep pretending everything is fine. But some nights, when everything becomes quiet, the truth finally reaches the surface. You feel tired. Mentally tired. Emotionally tired. Spiritually tired. Maybe there have been moments recently where you asked yourself questions you never thought you would ask. God, where are you? Why does this season feel so difficult? Why do I feel so lost when I have been praying so much? And sometimes those questions quietly turn into fear before you even realize it. Fear has a way of growing silently inside the human heart. Not always dramatic fear. Sometimes it sounds like constant overthinking. Sometimes it sounds like anxiety that never fully leaves. Sometimes it sounds like lying awake at night wondering if life will ever feel stable again. But today, before anything else, you need to remember something important. God has not lost control of your life. Not for one moment. Not during the confusion. Not during the pain. Not during the nights when your faith felt weak and exhausted. The book of Isaiah, chapter 41, verse 10 says, "Fear thou not, for I am with thee, be not dismayed, for I am thy God." That verse becomes deeply personal during painful seasons. Because when life feels uncertain, the human heart desperately needs reassurance that it is not walking through the storm alone. And maybe right now, that is exactly what your soul needs most. Not perfect answers. Not immediate solutions. Just the quiet reminder that God is still present even when life feels broken. Even when emotions feel unstable. Even when the future feels unclear. One of the most painful parts of suffering is how lonely it can feel sometimes. You try explaining what is happening inside you, but words never seem fully enough. And after a while, many people stop talking about their pain altogether because they become emotionally tired of trying to make others understand it. But God understands completely. He understands the emotional exhaustion you hide from people. He understands the thoughts you never say out loud. He understands the pressure you carry silently every single day. And even now, while you are trying to hold yourself together emotionally, God is still holding you together spiritually. Sometimes we think God only works through visible miracles, but often He works quietly in ways we cannot immediately recognize. He works through protection we never noticed. Through doors He keeps closed for reasons we cannot yet understand. Through painful seasons that slowly shape our character, deepen our faith, and teach our hearts to depend on Him more than before. And honestly, that process can feel uncomfortable. Because human beings naturally want clarity. We want to know when things will change. We want to know why certain prayers seem delayed. We want to understand why painful seasons last longer than expected. But faith often grows strongest in places where certainty does not exist yet. The book of Proverbs, chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding." That is easy to read during peaceful seasons. It becomes much harder during painful ones. Because trusting God while life feels stable is one thing, but trusting Him while your heart feels broken is something entirely different. And yet, that may be exactly where God is drawing you closer to Him right now. Not through comfort, not through easy answers, but through dependence. Through teaching your soul that His presence is still enough, even during seasons that feel confusing, painful, and emotionally exhausting. Maybe you do not fully understand this season yet. Maybe parts of your life feel uncertain right now. Maybe some prayers still seem unanswered. But God is not confused about your future, even when you are. He sees the full picture while you can only see the chapter you are currently living through. And even here, in the middle of this difficult season, one truth remains unchanged. God is still present. God is still faithful. And even when your life feels broken, God is still in control. One of the hardest feelings a person can experience is the feeling of losing control over life. Not knowing what comes next. Not knowing how certain situations will end. Not knowing whether things will get better or become even more difficult. And when uncertainty lasts too long, the human heart slowly begins carrying fear almost without noticing it. Sometimes the fear is hidden behind thoughts that never stop. You replay conversations in your mind. You imagine worst-case scenarios. You try to predict the future because part of you hopes that if you can prepare for everything emotionally, maybe the pain will hurt less when it comes. But constantly living in fear of tomorrow quietly steals peace from today. And many people become emotionally exhausted not because something terrible happened all at once, but because their minds never truly rest anymore. The pressure becomes constant. The overthinking becomes constant. The emotional tension becomes constant. Maybe lately your mind has felt like that. Heavy. Restless. Always carrying some invisible pressure in the background. Even during quiet moments, your thoughts continue running, searching for certainty that never fully comes. And the difficult truth is that human beings naturally want control. We want guarantees. We want clear answers. We want to know exactly how everything will unfold before we fully trust God with the future. But faith rarely works that way. The book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 7 says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." That means there will be seasons where you cannot clearly see what God is doing. Seasons where the future feels uncertain. Seasons where emotions become unstable. Yet even then, God asks you to continue trusting Him one step at a time. And honestly, that can feel difficult when life hurts. Because pain makes people crave certainty even more. When your heart feels wounded, you naturally want reassurance that things will eventually be okay. You want visible signs. You want immediate clarity. But God often teaches trust gradually, not instantly. Sometimes He calms the storm immediately. Other times, He strengthens you while the storm continues. And although both situations involve God's presence, the second one often produces deeper spiritual growth inside the soul. Because there are lessons the heart only learns during difficult seasons. The book of James, chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 says, "The trying of your faith worketh patience." That verse sounds beautiful until life actually tests your patience. Until prayers feel delayed. Until answers feel distant. Until waiting becomes emotionally exhausting and your heart begins wondering how much longer this season will continue. But even now, while you are waiting, God is still working. Silence does not mean absence. Delay does not mean rejection. And uncertainty does not mean God has stopped guiding your life. Many times, He is doing His deepest work in places your eyes cannot yet see. There are moments when God protects people by slowing things down. What feels like delay to you may actually be mercy. What feels like confusion may actually be redirection. And what feels like a closed door may eventually become the very thing that protected your peace, your purpose, and your future. But during painful seasons, it can be hard to recognize that immediately. Pain narrows perspective. Fear narrows perspective. Emotional exhaustion narrows perspective. And sometimes the human heart becomes so overwhelmed by the present moment that it forgets God can still create beautiful things from broken situations. The book of Romans, chapter 8, verse 28 says, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God." Not only the easy moments, not only the seasons that make sense, all things. Even the painful seasons that seem confusing right now. That does not mean every situation feels good emotionally. Some seasons deeply hurt. Some disappointments leave lasting emotional scars. Some losses completely change a person internally. But even then, God still has the power to bring healing, wisdom, and purpose out of situations that once felt impossible to survive. And maybe that is what your heart needs to remember today. Your story is not finished yet. This painful season is not the final chapter. And even if life feels uncertain right now, God is still leading you through every moment with a wisdom far greater than your fear. There are seasons where emotional exhaustion becomes so deep that even small things start feeling heavy. Simple decisions feel overwhelming. Rest no longer feels restorative. And your mind becomes trapped in an endless cycle of fear, pressure, and overthinking that quietly drains your peace day after day. Sometimes anxiety does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters slowly. A little fear here. A little stress there. One difficult season after another until eventually your heart no longer remembers what true calm used to feel like. And when people around you cannot see the battle happening inside your mind, it becomes even lonelier. You continue functioning externally while internally feeling exhausted. You keep carrying responsibilities while secretly wishing you could simply breathe without feeling pressure all the time. And after a while, your soul begins craving rest that sleep alone cannot provide. Maybe lately your thoughts have felt impossible to quiet. You try praying, but your mind keeps racing. You try distracting yourself, but the heaviness returns. You try staying hopeful, but fear keeps whispering worst-case scenarios into your thoughts when everything becomes silent at night. But fear has a dangerous habit of making the future appear darker than it truly is. It magnifies uncertainty. It magnifies pain. And sometimes it convinces people that because they cannot currently see the solution, God must not be working anymore. But that has never been true. The book of Psalms, chapter 46, verse 1 says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." Notice the wording carefully. Not a distant help. Not an occasional help. A very present help. Even in this season, God remains near. Even during emotional exhaustion, He remains near. Even while your thoughts feel heavy and your future feels uncertain, God has not stepped away from your life for a single moment. His presence is not controlled by your emotions. And sometimes that is important to remember because emotions constantly change. Some days you feel hopeful. Other days you feel drained. Some moments your faith feels strong. Other moments your heart feels tired and discouraged. But God's faithfulness remains steady even when human emotions fluctuate. The difficult part is that anxiety often makes people feel responsible for controlling everything. You start carrying tomorrow's problems before tomorrow even arrives. You try solving situations in your mind repeatedly. You imagine every possible outcome hoping it will somehow protect you emotionally. But carrying constant fear never creates peace. It only creates deeper exhaustion. The book of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 34 says, "Take therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself." Jesus understood something about the human heart that many people still struggle to accept today. Fear about the future steals strength from the present moment. And maybe that is exactly what has been happening inside you lately. Not only physical tiredness, emotional tiredness, mental tiredness, spiritual tiredness from carrying too many invisible burdens for too long without truly releasing them into God's hands. But God never asked you to carry life alone. He never asked you to survive through constant fear. He never asked you to pretend you are emotionally strong while secretly breaking inside. God invites weary hearts to come close to Him honestly, not perfectly. Sometimes healing begins the moment a person finally stops pretending everything is okay. The moment they finally say, "God, I am tired. God, I feel overwhelmed. God, I do not know how to carry this anymore." And strangely, those honest moments often become the beginning of deeper spiritual restoration. The book of 1 Peter, chapter 5, verse 7 says, "Casting all your care upon Him, for He careth for you." Not part of your worries. All of them. The fears you talk about openly and the fears you hide silently inside your heart. God cares about every burden you carry. And even now, while your life may feel emotionally overwhelming, God is still guiding your story with wisdom far greater than your understanding. He sees what fear cannot see. He sees what anxiety cannot see. He sees the future beyond this painful season. And one day, you may realize that even during the moments you felt most lost, God was still leading you every step of the way. One of the most difficult things about painful seasons is that God often works quietly while we are desperately looking for visible answers. We pray for immediate change. We ask for clarity. We ask for relief. But sometimes heaven feels silent, and the silence itself becomes part of the struggle. And if we are not careful, silence can create dangerous thoughts inside the heart. Maybe God forgot about me. Maybe my prayers are not being heard. Maybe nothing will ever change. But feelings are not always truth, especially during emotionally exhausting seasons. The truth is, God can be working powerfully even when you cannot immediately see evidence of it. Roots grow in hidden places before fruit becomes visible. Seeds grow underground long before anyone sees signs of life on the surface. And in the same way, God often begins His deepest work invisibly inside the human heart. The book of John, chapter 13, verse 7 says, "What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter." That verse carries deep comfort during confusing seasons because it reminds us that understanding often comes later, not immediately. Right now, you may only see broken pieces. You may only see uncertainty. You may only see unanswered prayers and emotional exhaustion. But God sees the entire picture from beginning to end. Nothing about your life is confusing to Him. Sometimes while you are praying for God to change your circumstances, He is first working to heal your heart. Because healed hearts handle blessings differently. Healed hearts carry wisdom differently. Healed hearts depend on God differently. And often, inner transformation must happen before external changes fully arrive. That process can feel frustrating sometimes. Especially when you feel emotionally tired already. You want relief quickly. You want the burden lifted quickly. You want peace immediately. But God sees layers of your life that you cannot fully see yet. The book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verse 11 says, "He hath made everything beautiful in His time." Not always in our timing. Not always in the timing our emotions would choose. But in His perfect wisdom, God knows exactly when healing, restoration, and breakthrough should arrive. And while waiting may feel painful, waiting is not always punishment. Sometimes waiting becomes preparation. Preparation emotionally. Preparation spiritually. Preparation for things your current version is not fully ready to carry yet. Many people ask God for bigger blessings while still carrying unhealed fear, anxiety, insecurity, or emotional wounds from past seasons. But God cares more about the condition of your soul than the speed of your success. He understands that some things must heal internally before certain doors can safely open externally. And honestly, that takes trust. Because healing rarely happens instantly. Growth rarely happens instantly. Deep spiritual maturity rarely happens instantly. Most of the important work God does inside people happens slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly over time. That is why faith becomes so important during difficult seasons. Faith keeps walking even without complete understanding. Faith continues trusting even when emotions feel unstable. Faith chooses to believe that God remains present even during seasons where life feels painfully uncertain. The book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 1 says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Not seen yet. That word matters. Because many times God is already moving before human eyes can recognize what He is doing. And maybe even now, while your heart feels tired, God is arranging things behind the scenes in ways you cannot yet imagine. Protecting you from situations you do not fully understand. Redirecting paths you thought you needed. Closing doors that would have damaged your peace later. Preparing healing that your heart has been crying out for silently. Sometimes God removes people because He sees what they would eventually become in your life. Sometimes He allows uncomfortable seasons because comfort was slowly distracting your soul from depending on Him. And sometimes what feels like loss today becomes the very thing that later saves your future emotionally and spiritually. You may not understand everything right now. You may still have questions. You may still feel emotionally overwhelmed some days. But even in the middle of uncertainty, one truth remains unchanged. God is still working, even when you cannot yet see His hands moving. There comes a point in difficult seasons where the heart becomes tired of trying to understand everything. Tired of asking why. Tired of searching for answers. Tired of carrying the pressure of needing life to make sense immediately. And sometimes, without realizing it, that exhaustion slowly pushes people toward surrender. Not surrender to fear. Not surrender to hopelessness. Surrender to God. The kind of surrender that quietly says, "Lord, I do not understand this season, but I trust that you still see the road ahead more clearly than I do." And honestly, that kind of trust does not happen naturally. Human beings naturally want control. We want certainty. We want reassurance that pain will end quickly and life will become stable again. But many times, God teaches deeper faith by asking us to continue walking even while the future remains unclear. The book of Psalm, chapter 37, verse 5 says, "Commit thy way unto the Lord, trust also in Him, and He shall bring it to pass." That verse sounds peaceful, but living it can feel difficult during emotionally exhausting seasons. Because real trust is tested most when emotions feel unstable. Sometimes surrender feels uncomfortable because it requires releasing things we desperately wanted to control ourselves. Relationships. Future plans. Situations we tried fixing repeatedly. Outcomes we worried about constantly. And many times, God waits until our hands finally loosen their grip before He begins showing us a different direction. That does not mean God is punishing you. Sometimes He is protecting you. Sometimes He is redirecting you. And sometimes He is teaching your soul that peace cannot come from controlling every circumstance around you. True peace only comes from trusting the One who already holds your future completely. The difficult truth is that fear and faith cannot lead the heart at the same time. One will always speak louder. Fear says, "What if everything falls apart?" Faith says, even if life feels uncertain, God remains faithful. And during painful seasons, the voice you listen to most begins shaping the condition of your heart internally. The book of Philippians, chapter 4, verses 6 and 7 says, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known unto God." And then comes the promise. "The peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Notice something important about that verse. God's peace does not always arrive after circumstances improve. Sometimes His peace arrives while the storm is still happening, while uncertainty still exists, while prayers still seem unanswered, while life still feels emotionally overwhelming. And maybe that is the kind of peace your soul truly needs right now. Not temporary comfort, not distractions, not false reassurance from the world, but deep inner peace that remains steady even when circumstances continue changing around you. Because circumstances will always change eventually. People change. Plans change. Seasons change. But God remains constant through every chapter of your life. His love does not become weaker during difficult seasons, and His presence does not disappear during moments of emotional exhaustion. Sometimes God allows people to reach the end of their own strength because that is where they finally discover how deeply they actually need Him. Not as a last option. Not as temporary emotional comfort, but as the true foundation holding their soul together when everything else feels unstable. The book of John, chapter 14, verse 27 says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you." Not the kind of peace the world gives. Not fragile peace dependent on perfect circumstances. The kind of peace that survives storms because it comes directly from God Himself. And maybe right now, even in the middle of your confusion, God is slowly teaching your heart how to rest in Him again. Not because every answer has arrived. Not because life suddenly became easy. But because your soul is beginning to realize that even when life feels broken, God remains completely in control. One day, you may look back at this season differently. Not because the pain was easy, but because you will finally see how faithfully God carried you through moments that once felt impossible emotionally. And you may realize that even during the darkest nights, His hands never stopped guiding your life quietly forward. Healing rarely happens all at once. Most of the time, God restores people slowly. Piece by piece. Prayer by prayer. Day by day. And during the process, there are moments when you may not even realize how much your heart is already changing internally. At first, all you notice is the pain, the confusion, the emotional exhaustion, the disappointment. But eventually, something begins shifting quietly inside you. The fear that once controlled your thoughts completely slowly starts losing strength little by little. Not because life suddenly became perfect, but because God begins rebuilding your heart from the inside. And internal restoration changes everything over time. It changes the way you think, the way you react, the way you handle fear, and the way you carry difficult seasons emotionally. The book of Ezekiel, chapter 36, verse 26 says, "A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you." That is one of the beautiful things about God. He does not only change circumstances. He also heals the heart that has been wounded by them. Sometimes people pray for God to remove the storm while God is focused on strengthening the person walking through it. Because stronger faith creates deeper peace. Stronger faith creates greater endurance. And stronger faith allows people to survive seasons that once would have completely broken them emotionally. Maybe that is already happening inside you now, even if you cannot fully see it yet. Maybe God is teaching your heart how to become calmer in uncertainty. Maybe He is teaching you how to depend less on circumstances and more on His presence. And although the process feels slow sometimes, spiritual growth often happens quietly. The difficult truth is that pain changes people. But pain surrendered to God can change people in beautiful ways. It can produce wisdom, compassion, emotional maturity, and a deeper understanding of God's faithfulness than comfort alone could ever teach. Some of the strongest people spiritually are not people who avoided pain completely. They are people who discovered God's presence in the middle of it, People who learned how to keep trusting Him even when life became emotionally exhausting. People who discovered that God remained faithful during seasons where nothing else felt stable anymore. The book of Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 31 says, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength." Renew. Not pretend. Not force. Renew. God knows how to restore strength inside tired hearts. And maybe your soul needs renewal more than anything right now. Not pressure to appear strong. Not pressure to have every answer. Not pressure to hide your emotions. You simply need God to breathe peace back into the parts of your heart that have felt overwhelmed for too long. Sometimes people become so emotionally drained that they stop expecting good things from life anymore. Disappointment slowly lowers their hope. Fear slowly lowers their expectations. And after enough painful seasons, the heart starts protecting itself by expecting the worst before it even happens. But God did not create your heart to live trapped in constant fear. He did not create you to spend your life emotionally paralyzed by anxiety about the future. And even if this season has been painful, God still has the power to restore joy, peace, and hope inside your life again. That restoration may not happen overnight. Healing takes time. Trust takes time. Emotional recovery takes time. But slow healing is still healing. Quiet progress is still progress. And even during difficult seasons, God continues working patiently inside the soul. The book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, verse 11 says, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace, and not of evil, to give you an expected end." Even when your future feels uncertain to you, it is not uncertain to God. He still sees purpose beyond this painful chapter of your life. And maybe one day you will realize that this difficult season did not destroy you the way you feared it would. Maybe it changed you. Maybe it deepened your faith. Maybe it taught your heart how to depend on God in ways comfort never could. And maybe the version of you that emerges from this season will carry more peace, wisdom, and spiritual strength than ever before. There are moments when God begins restoring hope so quietly that at first, you barely notice it happening. A little more peace during the day. A little less fear at night. A little more strength to keep moving forward. And slowly, without realizing it, the heart that once felt completely overwhelmed begins breathing differently again. Healing often starts subtly. Not dramatically. Not instantly. But gently. Like sunlight slowly entering a dark room after a long night. And many times, God restores people gradually so they learn to recognize His presence in small moments again. Maybe lately there have been moments where you felt small traces of peace returning. Moments where your mind felt calmer than before. Moments where fear lost its grip for a little while. Moments where you suddenly realized you survived things you once thought would completely break you emotionally. That matters more than you think. Because survival is not weakness. Continuing forward after painful seasons takes enormous strength. Especially when nobody fully understands the emotional battles you fought internally just to keep going day after day. The book of Psalm, chapter 30, verse 5 says, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." That does not mean painful seasons disappear immediately. But it does mean pain is not permanent. Darkness does not last forever. And God is still capable of bringing light back into places that once felt hopeless. Sometimes people become so focused on what they lost that they stop noticing what God is still protecting inside them. Your faith survived. Your heart survived. Your soul survived. And even during the seasons where life felt unbearably heavy, God continued carrying you quietly through every moment. There were nights you thought you would never emotionally recover from. There were moments you thought your heart would never feel peace again. There were seasons where fear seemed stronger than hope. But somehow, through every painful chapter, God continued sustaining your life one day at a time. And maybe now you are finally beginning to understand something important. God's presence was never dependent on perfect circumstances. He was present during the confusion. He was present during the anxiety. He was present during the waiting. And He remains present now as healing slowly continues inside your heart. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 31, verse 8 says, "And the Lord, He it is that doth go before thee, He will not fail thee, neither forsake thee." Not during peaceful seasons only. During every season. Even the painful ones that left you emotionally exhausted and spiritually drained. Sometimes people think strength means never struggling emotionally. But true spiritual strength often looks very different. Sometimes strength means continuing to trust God while still healing. Sometimes strength means continuing to pray while still carrying unanswered questions. And sometimes strength simply means refusing to give up completely during dark seasons. And honestly, that may be exactly what you have been doing without even realizing it. You kept going. You kept praying. You kept surviving days that felt emotionally overwhelming. And even when your faith felt weak at times, God still honored every quiet effort your heart made to keep holding on to Him. One day, this season will no longer control your emotions the way it once did. One day, the pain will not feel as heavy. One day, the confusion will begin making more sense. And one day, you may look back and realize that God was protecting, shaping, strengthening, and guiding you during every moment you once thought He was silent. The beautiful thing about God is that He does not waste pain. Nothing you suffered was invisible to Him. Nothing you cried about was ignored by Him. Nothing you carried silently escaped His attention. Even the battles nobody else knew about mattered deeply to Him. And maybe right now, more than anything else, your soul simply needs rest in that truth. You do not have to carry tomorrow alone. You do not have to solve every fear alone. You do not have to keep pretending you are emotionally okay all the time. God is still holding your life together even during the moments when you feel weakest internally. And even now, while parts of your journey may still feel uncertain, hope is quietly returning. Not because life suddenly became perfect, but because God never stopped walking beside you through the storm. And slowly, gently, faithfully, He is leading your heart toward peace again. And maybe right now, after everything your heart has been carrying, the most important thing you can do is simply slow down for a moment and remember that God is still here. Not far away. Not disappointed in you. Not absent from your pain. He is here, even in this very moment, quietly surrounding the parts of your soul that have felt tired for so long. Sometimes people spend so much time fighting fear internally that they forget they were never meant to fight every battle alone. God never asked you to carry the future by yourself. He never asked you to hold together every broken piece alone. And He never expected you to survive painful seasons without leaning on His strength completely. The book of Psalm, chapter 55, verse 22 says, "Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and He shall sustain thee." Not carry part of it. All of it. The fears you hide. The anxiety you never fully talk about. The emotional exhaustion that nobody else seems to notice. And maybe tonight, before trying to find every answer, your soul simply needs rest. Not escape. Not distraction. Real rest. The kind of peace that only comes when a weary heart finally stops trying to control everything and quietly places the future back into God's hands. Because the truth is, God has already been carrying you through moments you thought would completely destroy you emotionally. You survived nights you never thought you would survive. You survived emotional battles nobody knew about. You survived seasons where your mind felt overwhelmed and your heart felt deeply tired. And somehow, through every difficult chapter, God continued sustaining your life. Even when your faith felt weak, He remained faithful. Even when your emotions felt unstable, He remained steady. Even when your prayers felt unanswered, He continued working quietly behind the scenes. And one day, you may finally understand how many times God protected you without you even realizing it at the time. The Book of Lamentations, chapter 3, verses 22 and 23 says, "It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because His compassions fail not. They are new every morning." Every morning. Not only during easy seasons. Even after painful nights. Even after anxious thoughts. Even after emotionally exhausting days. And maybe that means tomorrow still carries hope, even if today felt heavy. Maybe healing is already happening more slowly and deeply than you realize. Maybe God is already rebuilding parts of your heart that fear once convinced you would never recover emotionally. Because God specializes in restoring things that human beings think are too broken to heal. So wherever you are right now, breathe for a moment. You do not need to have every answer tonight. You do not need to solve your entire future tonight. You do not need to carry tomorrow's weight tonight. God is already standing inside the future you are afraid of, and His presence will still be there when you arrive. And maybe right now, quietly there where you are, you can pray this with all honesty inside your heart. God, I am tired. Some days I feel strong, and other days I feel overwhelmed by everything happening inside me. But tonight, I choose to trust you again. Even when life feels uncertain. Even when I do not fully understand this season. Help me release the fear I have been carrying. Help me rest in your presence again. Heal the anxious parts of my mind. Heal the exhausted parts of my heart. Remind me that I am not alone, and that you are still guiding my life even when I cannot clearly see the road ahead. Teach me to trust you more deeply. Teach me to stop carrying burdens you never asked me to carry alone. And when fear tries to return, remind my heart that you remain faithful through every season of my life. The Book of Joshua, chapter 1, verse 9 says, "Be strong and of a good courage, be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest." Wherever you go. Into every tomorrow. Into every uncertain season. Into every battle still ahead. God goes with you. And if this message spoke to your heart today, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and continue walking in faith with us. And in the comments, write this simple reminder for your own heart. God is still in control.